Oprah Winfrey thought she had set the perfect trap on live TV. But Senator John Kennedy's response not only shocked her, it left the entire studio in silence. This is one story you won't forget. Welcome to Kennedy Tales, where every story inspires, surprises, and moves the heart. Oprah mocked John Kennedy's faith on live TV. His response left her stunned into silence. The Harpo studio glowed under towering lights, its polished floors gleaming like a stage set for history. Plush velvet chairs, a hushed audience, and the unmistakable presence of America's Queen of Media, Oprah Winfrey. She wasn't just a talk show host, she was a cultural titan. A woman whose words had shaped movements, created bestsellers, and inspired millions. That afternoon's episode was titled Spirituality in the New Age. A carefully orchestrated spectacle featuring best-selling authors, celebrity gurus, and thought leaders. But all eyes were fixed on the final guest, a man who didn't quite belong in this circle of polished mystics and modern philosophers. Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana. The cameras rolled. The applause rang out. But behind Oprah's warm smile, a sharper plan simmered. She wasn't just here to chat. Her producers had prepped her to push Kennedy into a corner, to challenge his unwavering Christian faith in front of millions. In her mind, she'd catch him looking rigid, outdated, maybe even foolish. It would be good television. Kennedy stepped onto the stage with the calm of a man walking into a Sunday service rather than a media ambush. His navy suit was neat, unpretentious, almost plain. In his pocket a small Bible rested, not as a prop but as a quiet anchor. His handshake was firm, his drawl unmistakably Southern. "Senator Kennedy, it's such an honor," Oprah began, her voice velvet, her smile polished. "Tonight, we're diving into spirituality, hope, and the many ways people connect to something greater than themselves." "Thank you, Oprah," Kennedy replied warmly. His voice carried that Bayo honesty, steady and unshaken. He leaned back, hands resting on his knees, outwardly relaxed. But inside, he'd already said a prayer. "Lord, give me wisdom, give me courage. Let me honor you." At first, Oprah kept things light. She asked about Louisiana, about his work in the Senate, about what it meant to serve people in such divided times. Kennedy answered with humor, painting pictures of farmers, teachers, and small-town preachers who had shaped his life. The audience chuckled, softened, even leaned in. Then Oprah struck, her tone sharpened, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Senator," she said smoothly, "you often speak about your Christian faith as the cornerstone of your life. But in a world as diverse as ours, where millions find meaning in so many different paths, isn't it outdated, maybe even arrogant, to claim there's only one way to God?" The question landed heavy, a dart aimed at the heart of Kennedy's convictions. The studio fell silent. The audience, restless with curiosity, shifted forward in their seats. Oprah's trap was set. He could double down and look small-minded or soften and look weak. Either way, she would win. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He turned not to Oprah, but to the people, his gaze steady, his voice low and deliberate, the cadence of a storyteller. "Oprah," he said, "let me tell you about a woman named Mary from Baton Rouge. She's a single mother. Lost her husband in a car wreck. Works the checkout line at a grocery store, raising 3 kids on little more than faith and grit. Life's been cruel to her. But every morning, before she heads to work, she sits at her kitchen table and prays. Not for money. Not for an easier life. Just for strength to keep going. She told me once, her faith in Jesus Christ is the only light in her darkest nights." The words rippled across the room like thunder in a storm. The audience wasn't hearing politics or theory. They were hearing raw truth. You could see it in the wet eyes, in the hushed breaths. A few dabbed at their cheeks, caught off guard by the simplicity. Oprah, still smiling, shifted in her chair. This wasn't the soundbite she'd expected. She had come prepared for a sharp theological sparring match, ready to expose Senator John Kennedy as rigid, outdated, maybe even intolerant. But instead of engaging in debate, he shared a personal story. A story that grounded faith not in theory, but in the raw grit of everyday life. Oprah tried to recover quickly, her voice carrying the faintest trace of condescension, as if correcting a guest who had strayed off topic. "That's a touching story, Senator," she said smoothly. "But I wasn't asking about personal anecdotes. My question is about your faith itself. In a diverse world, where people are free to choose their spiritual paths, isn't claiming there's only one way to God dangerous? Isn't it unfair to impose that on society?" The words cut sharper this time, designed to push Kennedy into a corner. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement with Oprah. After all, she was America's queen of inclusivity, the woman who had introduced meditation, mindfulness, and modern gurus to millions. Against that backdrop, Kennedy's unapologetic Christianity seemed almost defiant. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He leaned forward, meeting Oprah's eyes with steady calm. "Oprah," he said firmly, his Louisiana drawl quieting the room, "I'm not imposing anything on anyone. I'm not here to force people to believe as I do. But you asked about my faith, and I have to be honest. Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.' Those aren't my words, they're His. If I believe that, then it's my duty to share it. Not to bully, not to condemn, but to invite. People are free to choose. But I can't stay silent about what I know to be true." The words hit the room like a hammer wrapped in velvet. For a long beat, the audience sat frozen, absorbing the weight of his conviction. Some clapped softly, not necessarily out of agreement, but out of respect. Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. Yet his clarity cut through the haze of vague spirituality like a beam of light in fog. For the first time in her legendary career, Oprah felt the ground shift beneath her. She had expected to steer this conversation, to showcase her vision of an inclusive, marketable spirituality. But Kennedy wasn't playing by her rules. His quiet resolve was transforming the moment into something raw, something real, a moment of truth. Sensing her grip slipping, Oprah pressed harder, her smile tightening even as her tone sharpened. "Senator," she said, "you talk about absolute truth. But do you really believe that billions of people who follow other faiths, or none at all, are wrong? Doesn't that make your faith judgmental, intolerant?" The audience leaned forward, the tension thick enough to touch. It was a masterstroke question, one that seemed to leave Kennedy trapped. If he said yes, he'd be branded arrogant. If he said no, he'd contradict his own beliefs. Oprah's fans watched expectantly, waiting for the senator to falter. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, offering a silent prayer for wisdom, then looked up with steady kindness. "Oprah, truth doesn't bend to numbers or to feelings," he said, his voice carrying weight. "If I know a bridge is broken, I'm not going to wave people across it, no matter how much they believe it's safe. My faith isn't about judging others. It's about warning them and offering hope. I'm not saying people are worthless or condemned just because they believe differently. What I am saying is this: I've found a path, and because I love people, I want to share it with anyone willing to listen." The analogy landed with devastating simplicity. The audience broke into scattered applause, some hesitant, others thunderous. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the sincerity, the humility, the unshakable conviction. Oprah's famous composure wavered for just a second. She had expected soundbites, she had expected deflection. Instead, Kennedy had given something else: truth wrapped in grace. "That's an interesting perspective," she managed, her voice a touch tighter than before. But by then, everyone in the room knew it. The moment had already slipped from her control. The tension in the studio hadn't eased. It had only thickened. Oprah's voice carried just the faintest tremor as she leaned in. "Senator," she said, her smile stretched tight, "we'll dive deeper into this right after a short break." The lights dimmed, cameras cut to commercial, and the stage sank into shadows. Oprah glanced at Kennedy, her eyes flickering between frustration and reluctant respect. She knew the next segment would be more intense than anything yet. For the first time in her career, she wasn't certain she'd walk away the victor. Kennedy, however, sat in silence. His gaze drifted toward the audience, his lips moving in a quiet prayer. This wasn't just another interview. It was a battle of truths, and the next round could change everything. When the studio lights flared back to life, golden beams washing over the stage, the crowd stirred with anticipation. The buzz in the air was electric. What had begun as a polished primetime special on spirituality in the New Age had morphed into something raw and unfiltered. A clash of worldviews, less an interview and more a reckoning. Oprah straightened in her chair, her trademark poise intact. But her composure frayed just enough to reveal the strain beneath. She couldn't let Kennedy keep steering the narrative. She had built her empire on framing spirituality as inclusive, universal, marketable, and she wasn't about to let it be dismantled by a senator with a Bible in his pocket. The cameras zoomed in as she smiled, her tone honeyed but sharp, like velvet stretched over steel. "Welcome back, everyone," she purred. "We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, talking about faith, truth, and what it means to search for meaning in today's world. Senator, I appreciate your candor. You've spoken openly about how your Christian faith guides you. But let's be real." She paused for effect. "As a politician, you've also used that faith to connect with voters, to present yourself as a man of principle. Isn't that a kind of manipulation? Leveraging people's deepest emotions to win their trust?" The question hit like a grenade. The audience murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in agreement. Faith and politics, a combination as old as time and as volatile as fire. Oprah was betting on Kennedy to stumble, to look like just another opportunist hiding behind religion. But Kennedy didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, edges worn from being handled too many times. He set it gently on his knee, as though steadying himself. "Oprah," he said, his voice low and steady, "let me tell you about a boy named Tommy from New Orleans." The audience leaned in. Kennedy's tone shifted. Not rehearsed, not polished, but quiet and commanding, the voice of a man who carried stories heavier than sound bites. "Tommy's 10 years old. He's been in and out of the hospital his whole life with leukemia. A while back, his mama wrote me a letter. Said Tommy had watched one of my speeches on TV, where I talked about how God's love gives us hope, even when everything around us feels like it's falling apart." Afterward, Tommy grabbed her hand and said, "Mama, if that man says God loves me, then I'm not scared anymore." The words hung in the air. Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd, not to impress them, but to let them feel the weight of Tommy's story. "I didn't share that message to win votes, Oprah," he said softly. "I shared it because kids like Tommy, and moms like his, need something real to hold on to. My faith isn't a tool. It's the reason I get up every morning. It's why I do what I do." The studio fell into silence. The kind of silence that presses down on every chest. A few audience members wiped their eyes, others bowed their heads. Even those skeptical of Kennedy couldn't escape the raw sincerity in his words. Oprah, caught off guard, felt something shift inside. She had built her empire on the art of storytelling. But Kennedy's story wasn't polished or packaged. It was raw, unvarnished, and undeniable. She drew a breath, regaining her rhythm. "That's a powerful story, Senator," she said carefully, her smile returning, though tighter than before. "And I don't doubt it touches many hearts. But let's broaden this conversation. You speak of Christianity as the one true path. Don't you think that's a limited perspective in a global world, where billions of people find meaning through countless different traditions?" It was a pivot, an attempt to shift the battlefield. Oprah was the master of painting spirituality as a universal tapestry. Buddhism, meditation, self-help, all paths leading to the same summit. Kennedy's insistence on a single truth threatened that vision, and she knew she had to challenge it head-on. The audience stirred, murmuring their approval of her question. This was the Oprah they knew, the voice of reason, the champion of inclusion. But Kennedy didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly, hands clasped, his gaze unwavering yet respectful. "Oprah," He began, his drawl calm but edged with conviction. I respect that people search for meaning in all kinds of ways. But let me ask you something. If you saw a child about to walk into a burning building, Kennedy said slowly, his eyes steady, would you tell them there are many doors to try? Or would you point them to the one safe exit? The words cracked like thunder across the studio. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause that rose before the audience even realized it. The metaphor was simple, but devastating. Kennedy wasn't attacking other beliefs. He was making faith sound urgent, not theoretical. Truth, he implied, wasn't just an opinion. It was a matter of life and death. Oprah's smile wavered for the briefest second, a flicker of unease breaking through her polished veneer. She hadn't expected him to flip the conversation so cleanly, and the crowd's reaction told her she was losing ground. That's a vivid metaphor, Senator, she replied, her tone clipped but carefully professional. But you're sidestepping the real issue. My work, my books, my courses, they've helped millions of people find peace and purpose. Are you saying all of that is meaningless just because it doesn't line up with your faith? It was a trap, pure and calculated. If Kennedy dismissed her legacy, he'd alienate the millions who adored Oprah. If he endorsed it, he'd dilute his own message. The tension thickened. Every eye in the room locked on him, waiting. Kennedy didn't flinch. He looked at her, not with scorn, but with compassion that disarmed even her. His voice dropped softer, but somehow carried more weight. Oprah, I don't doubt you've helped people feel better. Encouragement matters. Kindness matters. And I respect that. But feeling better isn't the same as being saved. Pain can ease for a season. But it doesn't answer the deepest questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? My faith tells me only Jesus answers those questions. And I'd be lying if I said otherwise. The studio went silent. Not the awkward silence of discomfort, but the sacred hush of a room holding its breath. Kennedy's words hadn't come like a politician's talking points. They came like a confession, raw and unyielding. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily. Others dabbed their eyes. Many of them had spent thousands chasing peace through Oprah's miracle seminars, spiritual retreats, or self-help gurus. But Kennedy's message, simple, unpolished, free, was cutting deeper than all of it. For the first time, Oprah felt her empire tremble. She had built her brand on the idea that spirituality could be packaged, repackaged, and sold. But Kennedy's testimony wasn't a product, it was a lifeline. She leaned forward, her voice rising, reaching for control. Senator, you're talking about salvation as though it belongs only to your path. But what about the billions of people who find joy, wisdom, and meaning outside Christianity? Are they all misguided? The audience erupted with applause, emboldened by Oprah's pushback. She was, after all, their icon, the woman who had given them permission to embrace every path to the divine. Kennedy, standing firm, seemed to threaten that freedom. But Kennedy didn't retreat. His hand brushed the worn, folded paper on his knee, as if drawing strength from it. Then he lifted his gaze to Oprah, his voice steady but urgent. Oprah, I'm not here to argue over who's right or wrong. I'm here to share what I know. When I was younger, I searched everywhere, books, philosophies, gurus, you name it. And every answer I found left me empty. Until I met Jesus. Not a system, not a religion, a person. He said, come to me, and I will give you rest. That's not arrogance, that's surrender. I'm just a man who grabbed a lifeline. And if I see someone drowning, I'm going to throw it to them. The words crashed over the studio like a tidal wave. Some burst into applause. Others sat frozen, wrestling with what they'd just heard. Kennedy wasn't preaching, he was testifying. And that difference was unmistakable. Oprah's hands gripped her chair tighter. For the first time, her carefully curated calm cracked at the edges. She had spent decades building an empire on polished spirituality, hope sold at a premium. Kennedy's message, unpolished and unprofitable, was free. And the audience was no longer just watching her. They were staring at him now. Every eye in the studio locked on Kennedy, clinging to his words as if they carried weight beyond politics. For the first time, Oprah felt the spotlight slip from her hands. Desperate to take it back, she struck with her sharpest line yet. "Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "your faith is clearly important to you. But let's be honest, you're a public figure, a man with influence. When you say Jesus is the only way, you're not just sharing a personal belief. You're shaping how people think, how they vote, how they live. Isn't that a kind of power you're wielding? Maybe even a dangerous one." The challenge hung heavy in the room. The audience stirred, some nodding, others whispering, all waiting for Kennedy's response. The accusation was clear: his faith wasn't just belief, it was influence, and influence could be control. Kennedy's eyes softened, but his voice stayed unshaken. "Oprah," he said gently, "power's a funny thing. You can use it to build yourself up, or to lift others higher. My faith isn't about control. It's about freedom. Freedom from fear, from guilt, from chasing things that never last." He reached for the worn, folded paper on his knee, holding it lightly, almost reverently. "I talk about Jesus because I've seen what he does. For kids like Tommy, for mothers like Mary, for people like me. If that's power, it isn't mine. It's his." His voice dropped, quieter but burning with conviction. "This letter, from Tommy's mama. She thanked me for giving her boy hope. That's why I'm here, Oprah. Not to win arguments, not to push people around, but to point them to the only one who can carry them through." The studio erupted. Not polite applause, but the kind that breaks from the heart. People clapped through tears, some whispered prayers, others simply sat in awe. The atmosphere shifted. Kennedy's words had done what no book, no course, no empire could. They'd pierced something eternal. Oprah sat frozen, her face pale. For the first time in her career, she realized she wasn't just losing a debate. She was losing the audience. Worse still, she felt something stirring inside her own heart, something she couldn't control. As the show cut to break, the cameras fading to black, Oprah glanced at Kennedy. Her eyes carried a strange mix of defeat and respect, as if she recognized the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Kennedy quietly folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket, his heart steady. He knew the battle wasn't over. But whatever came next, he was ready. When the final segment began, Harpo Studios no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a sanctuary. The air was thick with anticipation, with questions too deep for sound. The audience leaned forward, caught between two worlds: the empire Oprah had built and the eternal hope Kennedy spoke of. And for the first time, Oprah's voice trembled. Not with power, but with longing. She tried to answer, her voice trembling. "Senator, I've helped millions. I've seen lives changed. Are you saying that doesn't matter because it's not your faith?" Her tone was defensive, but underneath was a rawer question. "What if I've been wrong?" Kennedy didn't seize on it. Instead, he smiled gently, the kind of smile that disarms without dismissing. "Oprah, what you've done matters. Kindness always does. But the real question isn't whether you've helped people feel better. It's whether you've pointed them to the one who can make them whole. Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to make us new. That's the difference." The word struck like a quiet thunderclap. The audience felt it ripple through the room. Some clapped softly, others sat frozen, reflecting on their own search for meaning. Oprah's face wavered, her eyes shining with tears she hadn't let fall. For the first time, she saw herself not as the bringer of hope, but as someone who had been offering a substitute. In a moment that would be replayed endlessly, Oprah stood, her legs unsteady. "Senator," she said, her voice breaking, "I've built my life on helping people. But if I've been pointing them to the wrong thing, what does that make me?" The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. The audience gasped, their icon revealing a vulnerability they had never witnessed. Kennedy rose too, not to claim victory, but to meet her. He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice steady and tender. "Oprah, it makes you human, just like the rest of us. The good news is Jesus doesn't need you to have it all figured out. He takes your mistakes, your broken pieces, and makes them into something beautiful. That's grace. A tear streamed down Oprah's face, unhidden and unpolished. The audience, many weeping as well, watched in awe as she sank to her knees, not in defeat, but in surrender. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I've always been in control." Kennedy knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. "That's exactly where he wants you. Out of answers, ready to listen. That's where we all begin." He turned toward the audience, his eyes filled with compassion. "Jesus said, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.' That's not about money. It's about knowing you need Him. That's where real freedom starts." The studio felt transformed, as if the stage had become sacred ground. Kennedy bowed his head, praying quietly, not for spectacle, but with the sincerity of a shepherd interceding for a soul. "Jesus," he prayed, "here's your daughter Oprah. She's tired of carrying the weight alone. Show her your love, your truth, your rest." Oprah wept, not the polished tears of performance, but the raw sobs of a heart breaking open. The audience joined in, some praying aloud, others simply sitting in reverent silence. When the show ended, there was no music, no applause for entertainment's sake, only a holy hush. Oprah stood again, her face softer, her eyes clearer. "I don't know what this means for my work," she admitted, her voice steady but vulnerable. "But I know I can't go back to pretending I have all the answers." The audience applauded gently, not for a show, but for her courage. Months later, Oprah made a stunning announcement. She was ending her spiritual courses, redirecting her empire toward quiet service, visiting hospitals, supporting families, and sharing the hope she had found. Kennedy continued his Senate work, his faith unshaken, but his humility deepened. The lesson: truth spoken in love can pierce even the hardest hearts. Real faith doesn't need flash, profit, or polish. It thrives in humility, in service, in action. In a world addicted to quick fixes, Kennedy's stand reminds us to cling to what lasts: love, grace, and a Savior who meets us exactly where we are. Ask yourself, what are you holding on to? And are you brave enough to let the truth reshape it? The path to freedom always begins with one honest step.